Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lisa Marshall. I am the Director of Organizing and Advocacy here at New Yorkers for Clean Power. Welcome to our April not our April Power Hour, our April teach-in. Can New York afford climate law rollbacks? I think we all know the answer to this rhetorical question. And here to talk us through some of these very timely issues as our climate law is in the midst of deep negotiations in Albany are three incredible speakers. We're going to start with Liz Moran, who is the New York policy advocate at Earthjustice. Liz is actually the very first New York policy advocate that was ever hired at Earthjustice. She's based in Albany, New York. She's a veteran environmental policy advocate who joined Earthjustice from NYPIRG, or the New York Public Interest Research Group, where she served as environmental policy director. And since joining Earthjustice, Liz has led the fight in Albany for many of our most significant legislative efforts on climate, including the All-Electric Building Act and the New York Heat Act. Liz can only stay for the first part of this teach-in because of how busy she is right now. So if you have questions for Liz, please type them into the chat while she's speaking, and we will try to get to some of your questions. Otherwise, please stay muted, and let's welcome Liz, who is going to give us a lot of background to what led up to where we are today in our fight for New York's landmark climate law that is currently under threat. So Liz, please go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the really nice introduction, Lisa. And hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thanks so much for joining. I know for many of us, this has been a really hard fight. So I'm happy to chat a little bit about what's going on, what we could anticipate, what's been happening so far that's brought us to this moment. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. So, as Lisa previewed, we're currently fighting for our climate law to be preserved. And what's happening is this conversation is taking place during the state budget process. So to add some context here, right, a number of folks here maybe were part of this. So a few years ago, back in 2023, the governor attempted to do something similar. The governor tried to sneak into the budget process rollbacks to the climate law, but specifically changes to how the state accounts for greenhouse gas emissions under the law, which you're going to learn about more from Laura Haight in a bit during this conversation. So we were able to successfully fight that back in 2023, but ever since that was introduced into the conversation, the governor has seemed interested in changing the accounting of the law along with other changes. So to catch you up to speed with the timeline here to bring us to where we are now, there have been rumors that the governor was interested in changing the climate law in this year's budget in the winter, like before the legislative session even started, which is traditionally early January. And the reason those rumors were percolating was in part because the governor has broken the law. So the state climate law requires regulations to be promulgated by 2024. And the governor had plans to issue those regulations through a cap and invest program. And those regulations were getting ready to be issued by early 2025. But what ended up happening was during the governor's State of the State address in January 2025, the governor announced that she would actually no longer be pursuing those regulations and they would be indefinitely delayed. At that point, Earthjustice is representing clients where we have litigated against that decision by the Department of Environmental Conservation. So that's been playing out in the courts. You'll hear more about that later as well, and it'll be woven into what I'm going over because it's all connected. So we litigate, the governor's mad about it, and so far we've been winning in the courts. The lawsuit is over the fact that the governor hasn't issued any regulations. It's not about the substance. And the courts have said that the law is clear, that regulations must be issued. The governor has appealed that litigation, and that is still underway. So, to catch you up to the budget process and why this is all happening in the budget, I want to give credit where credit is due. This little map is something I stole from the Schuyler Center's Instagram, which is why you also see some little graphics on here that are not related to the timing that we are currently in. But let me walk folks through it. So, the state budget process is what takes up the bulk of New York's legislative session, January through April. And under New York State's Constitution, the governor has tremendous power in the budget process. So that gives the governor an opportunity to get policy done through the budget that she may not get otherwise. So let's start from the top. Before legislative session even begins, state agencies and the executive chamber start working together around what will become the governor's budget proposal. So that's taking place November, December of a calendar year. Then we enter the legislative session, which begins in early January. And one of the first things that happens is the governor releases her executive budget proposal. So that's the first thing that's publicly available. The governor releases language for what she is looking for in a budget. So that happens in mid-January. Once that happens, it starts to trigger the formal budget process. So after that, there are public hearings that are held by the legislature to go over what was proposed in the executive budget. That takes place usually late January through February. So it's another public part of the budget negotiating process. At the same time, it's not on here, the governor does have one more opportunity to publicly modify her proposals in something called 30-day amendments. So during this period, all of us were already starting to hear that the governor was interested in doing something about the climate law, changing the climate law. But there was no language in her executive budget proposal. It didn't come up during budget hearings. And then her 30-day amendment period comes and passes, and there's nothing in her 30-day amendments. So after that, the Assembly and the Senate have their opportunity to weigh in on the budget process, and usually by early to mid-March, they release their one-house budget proposals. So it's amendments to the governor's proposal as counteroffers on what they want to see. Now, once that happens, that more or less concludes the more public parts of the budget process. The rest of it tends to take place in negotiations behind closed doors. Many of you may be familiar with the old adage of 3 men in a room. It's no longer 3 men, but that is still how it takes place. A lot of the conversations are at a leadership level, directly between the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the Majority Leader of the Senate. So this is where funny business can occur. So because the governor has outsized power in the budget process, she can aim to insert policy into the budget conversations, even if it wasn't in her proposal, in her 30-day amendments, or in either one-house proposal. So that's what's happening right now with our climate law. The governor announced via op-ed a series of substantial changes she is interested in making that would ultimately gut our climate law. So those conversations are still underway. And as you'll see here, there is a statutory deadline for the budget to be done on April 1st, something that former Governor Andrew Cuomo took a lot of pride in was on time or timely budgets. Budgets were getting done usually on April 1st or a day or two after. So very close to the deadline. But here we are now on April 16th, and we still don't have a budget. And this has been the general trend of Governor Hochul. Governor Hochul has not adhered to the April 1st statutory deadline and instead has been passing extender bills to keep the government functioning while backdoor negotiations about the budget continue. So that's the budget process. So let's go to the next slide. Talk a little bit more about where we are. So here you could see some headlines that kind of outline what's been going on. On March 20th, the governor put forward her proposal via op-ed. So again, no formal budget language, nothing truly transparent for the public. On March 20th, she issued an op-ed and she put it on her website. So the thing is, though, the governor did some legwork to work up to this rollback. So if we go to the next slide, on February 26th, a memo was released from NYSERDA. So this chain of events was really peculiar. So what ended up happening was Blake Washington, who's the governor's budget director, was speaking at a public event held by the Citizens Budget Commission. And during that event, he was asked about the climate law and stated that the climate law would cost New Yorkers around $4,000 per year. And that was a really alarming number. And people were like, what is he talking about? That we've never heard that before. How would the climate law cost New Yorkers $4,000 per year? So reporters started asking questions about that figure. And then magically, a memo gets produced by NYSERDA a day later that asserts that a cap and invest program would cost New Yorkers around $4,000 per year. So this was really alarming. And the memo, to be clear, it's about 3 pages. And it's based off of a really simplistic and misleading understanding of what a cap and invest program should be. So a couple things to make clear about this NYSERDA memo. So the governor's office insisted that the litigation would force what is outlined in the NYSERDA memo. Now, that is not true. Our litigation is about the start date for regulations. It has nothing to do about the substance of those regulations. So if we go to the next slide. So Earthjustice issued a memo responding to the NYSERDA memo and briefed lawmakers on what the litigation is about. So you can see here an article that came out not too long after the governor had announced what she was looking to do in terms of rollbacks. And we make clear that the governor is trying to use the lawsuit as an excuse to evade her responsibility. So if we go again to the next slide. So when we held this briefing, we discussed the memo at length, and we explained that it was a deliberately extreme version of cap and invest that includes none of the safeguards that cap and invest programs elsewhere include. And we clarify again, the lawsuit does not force the state to implement any specific policy, and certainly not what was outlined in the NYSERDA memo. So some of the key points that Earthjustice made is the fact that A, NYSERDA is conflating cap and invest with the climate law. So they're arguing that the climate law is going to cost this much, and the only way to do it is through this extreme cap and invest program. But that's not true. The state actually engaged in a multi-year scoping plan process that explores the variety of ways that the state is going to need to take to meet the targets of our climate law. No one has ever asked nor expected a cap and invest program by itself to meet the targets of the law. It's a very important tool. It can help raise money to put back into people's wallets while reducing pollution. So it can be a really good program, but no one has asked for what was outlined in the NYSERDA memo. So that's one thing to know. This memo really played into a narrative right now where climate action is raising people's bills. And once we released our rebuttal, the governor did eventually confess that the climate law is not what is currently raising people's energy bills. So that was one of the problems there. as you see in this piece and something we issued in our rebuttal, the cost estimates in the NYSERDA memo represent a deliberately extreme version of cap and invest, something that would never be implemented in real life. Consumer protection measures that are commonplace in similar policies would also be put in place in New York. So this memo is misleading because NYSERDA doesn't count for any of that. The other thing that we outline that's really important is that this memo departs wildly from other estimates that the state has put out for a cap and invest program. Now, I mentioned before, the state was getting ready to put forward regulations before the governor announced they would no longer be doing them. So there's a number of analyses that show how this can be done. And this differs greatly from those. And then lastly, what we outline in our memo is how we need our climate law. The main driver of increased energy costs in New York is gas and the gas system. And now we have a war that is driving those costs up even more. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we are now. So we're fighting tooth and nail to get the legislature to reject the governor's efforts to roll back the climate law, especially in light of what is happening federally. We have this war overseas that is driving up gas prices, and we've already been facing an energy affordability crisis in New York. Energy bills have been going up because the costs of maintaining and expanding the gas system are going up. Gas prices at the pump are going up. A key tool to freeing New Yorkers from these increased energy costs, from what is happening federally, is implementing our climate law to make sure that we have tools to move away from expensive and dirty fossil fuels and towards the solutions that we know will save people money. And that's more renewables and energy efficiency. So at a time when the federal government is raising our costs, the governor is proposing something that doubles down on that. So I'll pause at this point to see if folks have any questions. I know it's a lot. It's a confusing timeline. It's very layered. So I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you so much, Liz. There are some questions about methane accounting, but we're going to hold those because we have a whole section on accounting. So let's hold that question till later. Please put your questions into the chat. And Liz is going to answer questions on sort of the political landscape and what led here. But as far as the details on the accounting, we're going to hold those questions. One thing I wanted to point out is that in the press, Governor Hochul is really taking her case to the public, saying, I just need more time. I just need more time. I just need more time. And, she has a lot of excuses for why she needs more time, and some of them are valid and some of them aren't. But behind the scenes, she's not just asking for more time. She's really asking to completely make the law have no teeth and to make it not drive any climate policy at all in the short term. So I think it's important for people to understand that this idea that she just is asking for an extension on her homework is really not true. She's asking to basically not have to turn in any homework at all. And sorry to use a teacher analogy, I used to teach middle school. So I think it's important that folks know that. Raheem, can you type your question in the chat, or did you already? I see your hand up there. Laura, we're going to hold your question on cap and invest for Eric. And we're going to hold Anne's question on cap and invest for Eric as well. Melissa asks, this is a question maybe you want to take, Liz. Is NYSERDA political and pressured by big oil? Do you want to give a take on that?
Yeah, this is a great question. NYSERDA is ultimately, like the other agencies and authorities in the state, a vehicle of the governors. It's part of the executive branch. So, of course, NYSERDA itself is going to be lobbied by many of the same interests that the governor is, but I do not believe it is coincidental that the governor's budget director announced astronomical costs associated with the climate law, and then magically a memo got produced by NYSERDA. I think that this really falls on the governor here.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And, NYSERDA has produced many, many documents, years of documents on the benefits of the climate law and the ways we can implement the climate law, as is their job, that sort of directly contradict this particular memo. So I think what we are assuming is that they were leaned on to produce a memo that made the case that the governor wanted to make, as and they sort of had no choice but to follow through, is what I would say. um, she asked for that backup, and we can remember that in 2023, when she tried to roll back the climate law the first time, she had NYSERDA and the DEC going on the media defending it. Then they do work for her. um, okay. I'm looking at Ron's question. It's maybe just a statement here. Let's all just thank Liz so much for presenting today during a very busy day in the budget fight and taking the time to do that. And we'll go to our next speaker for the interest of time. We could talk about this part. Just each of the presenters today could be a whole hour, and we crammed them all into one. Thank you so much, Liz, and really appreciate you. I want to introduce now our next speaker, who is really going to go into some more detail than probably any of us have heard on the different pieces of the greenhouse gas accounting that is currently enshrined in New York's climate law, and why each one is important. Let me just introduce Laura Haight, who currently serves as policy advisor to the Partnership for Policy Integrity, known as PFPI, a Massachusetts-based nonprofit that promotes science-based policies to protect our forests, restore our climate, and advance clean energy solutions at the state, federal, and international levels. A veteran of New York's environmental movement, Laura has more than 3 decades of experience in environmental advocacy, policy and analysis, campaign coordination, and strategic communications. She lives and works out of her home in the Hudson Valley. And I'll share the website of Laura's organization in the chat, as well as a copy of Laura's wonderful memo on greenhouse gas accounting. So with that, I will turn this over to Laura. Welcome.
Hi, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. It's great to be here. I am going to be going through a lot of material. I'll try to go slow. These are issues that are really important to how our climate law works. And I found that a lot of people don't understand some of the concepts. So I'm going to walk you through 3 of the major changes that are being proposed. And as Liz said, we don't have any language. This has been like, an extreme example of the secrecy of budget negotiations. But we were able to pretty much guess what's on the table, at least some of the things on the table in terms of changing the climate law based on the governor's op-ed, the NYSERDA memo that Liz referred to, and also the 2023 proposed language changes. So this presentation is how combined, each and every one of these changes would magically make carbon emissions disappear. Next slide. So the first Disappearing Act, methane emissions. I think this is the one people are most familiar with. As you know, the climate law currently uses a 20-year time frame. People don't really know what that actually means, so I'm going to say exactly what that means. The climate law covers more than just CO2. It covers all greenhouse gas emissions. But to regulate them effectively, you have to convert those into carbon dioxide equivalents. That's called the global warming potential of each of these are calculated relative to CO2 emissions. So, at 20 years, what will this greenhouse gas be like compared to CO2 at 100 years, 500 years. So those are the different timeframes that are typically used when calculating global warming potential. So we have a global warming potential of 20 years, which is 100% appropriate for several reasons. One is that the climate can't wait. The sooner we make deep cuts to our emissions, the sooner we can see benefits, and the climate crisis really sort of requires us to act as quickly as we can. Governor Hochul wants to change this to a 100-year time frame. So let's look at methane, which is the major reason why we've all pushed so hard for the 20-year time frame. Methane is produced, it actually is natural gas, and renewable natural gas are basically mostly methane. And throughout the whole production, extraction, transportation process, there's a tremendous amount of methane leakage. It's a very significant contributor to global warming. And what happens when you change it to a 100-year time frame? Magic. According to EPA, because methane is a relatively short-lived gas, at 20 years, its global warming potential is 81 to 83 times that of CO2. But at 100 years, it drops down to 27 to 30. Now, that's a big reduction in methane emissions that would suddenly happen magically if we change to that 20-year time frame. I'll take more questions on this after the presentation, but because this is the one concept I felt was people were most on top of, I don't spend much time on it. Next slide, please. I'm going to spend more time on how CO2 emissions are disappeared in this process. So here's some terminology you'll want to look for in whatever language does come out. Sorry, Holly. Well, we'll come back to it in the Q&A. Life cycle analysis, GREET, biogenic emissions discounting. These are all things you're probably heard about or maybe haven't, but this is what the governor wants to do, is to change our whole emissions accounting methodology to what's called a life cycle analysis methodology. And that's a way to make a lot of CO2 emissions disappear if it's done poorly, which, by the way, is exactly what the biofuels industry is pushing for. Life cycle analysis is particularly useful for making CO2 emissions from biomass and biofuels disappear, but also bear in mind that fossil fuels using carbon capture and sequestration would also get a big boost from life cycle analysis. Right now, the law doesn't allow our electricity to be, but by 2040, the electricity is supposed to be zero emission, not net zero emission, not something that's determined by life cycle analysis, just straight up emissions. And that's a very, very clean law, and we should be proud of it. Next slide. So here's the language that we saw in 2023. It's tiny, but in two different places, they presented putting, full life cycle basis, which sounds very reasonable, sounds very scientific, utilizing the Argonne GREET model, the greenhouse gases, regulated emissions and energy use and technologies model, to calculate those emissions. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that specific model and why. This is where the magic happens, is how they write the statute. Putting that language in, not just the life cycle analysis, but the Argonne GREET model, guarantees an outcome of not counting the CO2 emissions from burning these biomass or biofuels. However, just to be on the safe side, they added in another provision, the bottom right one, in accordance with internationally accepted best practices, which is a complete lie, carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion of sustainable biomass and biofuels shall not be counted towards the statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits. So they are really making sure that the CO2 would disappear, the CO2 emissions. Now, next slide, please. So what is life cycle analysis? Life cycle analysis is generally looking at the entire entire greenhouse gas emissions throughout the production, transportation, and usually use of the finished fuel. It'll vary depending on how it's developed. It was initially and most commonly used for the federal renewable fuel standard. And it's very, very complex, involves a lot of assumptions and inputs, and consequently can easily be gamed. And this GREET model that they tried to put in the law in 2023, which was initially developed for the RFS and now has been modeled, used for other applications,
Sorry, Laura,
counts also
can you remind people what the RFS is? Oh,
renewable fuel standard. Sorry, that specific model counts all CO2 from biofuels combustion as zero. Now that's on the assumption that the biofuel, whatever fuel it was, will grow back and absorb the CO2 that was released when it was burned. It also undercounts other types of emissions associated with the production. For instance, with biofuels, there's a lot of land use change. They're cutting down forests, tropical rainforests, to grow more fuel crops to create biofuels. That's a huge loss of carbon, not necessarily counted in these models. Next slide, please. So there's lots of different types of bio-based fuels, wood, fuel crops, alcohol fuels is like ethanol, garbage, the organic component of municipal solid waste, landfill gas. I'm going to talk mostly about the next slide, wood, only because next slide, please. Only because that's what my organization works on. It's what I know the best about, but I think I can do a good job of illustrating sort of the concept of how the life cycle analysis can be gamed and how this could significantly impact how it scores in these types of analyses. Most of the biomass electricity does come from burning trees. Next slide, please, which is right now not allowed under the climate law. So here's one indisputable fact. Wood-burning biomass power plants emit more CO2 per megawatt hour out the stack than coal or gas-fired plants. Nobody disputes this. Nobody. And it's like 50% more than fossil fuels, 200 or 300% more than natural gas. This is a fact. It's very, very polluting. And that's because wood is high moisture content. It burns inefficiently. Most of the carbon goes out the stack. Next slide. Somehow, though, this is the theory that wood is great, all biomass is great. This is the perfect world, the closed loop carbon cycle compared to fossil fuels, which go straight from the ground up into the atmosphere. Biomass fuels, it's a beautiful thing. They burn the fuel. It could be a tree, it could be garbage, it could be whatever. The emissions come out are biogenic CO2 emissions that goes in the atmosphere, and then the new trees, absorb it back. It's a perfect little circle. It's so clean and green. Next slide. Next slide, please. In reality, however, for wood-burning power plants, I'm sorry, go back, please. Sorry, Lorenzo, thanks for your help. So what we want to see, obviously, is no fossil fuel plants. This is the upper thing. Wind or solar, let the trees grow, because we actually need the trees. Hello? We need the trees to absorb, the excess carbon dioxide that we already have built up in the atmosphere. That's our greatest carbon capture and sequestration technology we have going on, and it's free. Just don't cut down the trees. Under the fossil fuel scenario, you still have the trees, but you're polluting, with the CO2 emissions. Under a biopower scenario, you are not only producing huge amounts of CO2, but you're also cutting down the trees that we need to absorb it. So that's the reality of the situation in a very simple frame. But in the next slide, I'll present it in a different way. This is the curve. With biomass CO2 emissions, and what this applies to biofuels as well, the emissions are higher in the beginning compared to the fossil fuel that it would be replacing. Obviously, it's always going to be higher compared to a zero emission fuel. Higher, and that point where it's in flux, where the new growth actually is absorbing the emissions that would have been emitted from fossil fuels, that point where you have a carbon benefit could take years, it could take decades for trees. In some cases, it could take hundreds of years, and in some cases, it might never take place because the new growth doesn't occur. But it's always going to be higher. So if we're looking at trying to address near-term emissions, which we need to, just bear that in mind. Next slide. And then for trees, again, this is our area of expertise as an example for burning wood for electricity, if you're burning mixed wood, which is combination residues and whole trees cut for wood, it can take over 90 years to meet that flux point. Over 90 years of releasing more CO2 emissions than what's in what would have come out from fossil fuels. So when the NYSERDA memo talks about short-term, impacts, these are not necessarily short-term in terms of what we're dealing with. Yes, the slides will be distributed. And next slide, please. So trying to go through this quickly, here's a case study of what happens when you apply life cycle analysis to a biomass power plant. This facility is in an EJ community in Vermont. There are some, and of course, that's where the polluting biomass power plant is, just north of Burlington. Next slide, please. It went through a life cycle analysis and it looked pretty damn good, because when they do these life cycle analyses on biomass fuels, whether it's a biofuel or biofuel, which is liquid or wood, solid wood, they are going to be looking at only the CO2 emissions. They'll be looking at other emissions. And by the way, there's a lot of gimmickry and a lot of games played, and we don't have time for me to give all the examples. But they're only looking at the CO2 emissions from fossil fuels that are used in the production, harvesting, transport, and utilization of that fuel. So from just the fossil fuel, CO2 emissions from McNeil look great, 16,000 metric tons. That makes their average greenhouse gas emissions 0.07 tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, which makes it so much cleaner than the ISO fuel mix. But when you add in the actual CO2 emissions from the burning wood, it changes the entire equation. Now, wood is going to be much more extreme. It's much more carbon intense than any of the other biofuels other than garbage. Solid waste, but so you're not going to see this incredible disparity when you look at these life cycle analyses for biofuels, but it's the same general idea that they either undercount or don't count really important things. Next slide, please. And this is close to my last slide. So in 2023, the biofuels industry made a big deal about how the GREET model is what's used everywhere. The federal government using it, we're going to be using it for the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, which actually only a few of them required the use of GREET. One of them was for the clean hydrogen production tax credit. Well, when they came out with their proposed model, they modeled corn stover, which is corn stalks and leftovers, and logging residues, which don't get me started. We don't have time for me to talk about all the lies in the biomass world. And look at this amazing magic act. Logging residues, which you saw that if they come out of the stack, this would be much more polluting than coal. Suddenly, when you make all these emissions disappear, it's cleaner than geothermal energy. Now, the good news is, and I don't know if it's because we pointed it out, but the final hydrogen GREET model didn't include logging residues. And what's really important when you talk to legislators, I mean, if you want to get this far into the weeds with them, is that it was also rejected for the clean electricity production tax credit. And trust me, the federal government was lobbied hard by the industry to use that GREET model for the electricity production tax credit. So their choice to reject it was really significant and something that New York lawmakers would benefit from. And I am indeed, next slide, please. The third disappearing act, the out-of-state emissions. That's an obvious one, doesn't require a whole lot of discussion that, if you remove out-of-state fossil fuel production from the CLCPA, you're losing all the methane leaks that occur when oil and gas are drilled. They are making some real confusion between greenhouse gas inventories versus accounting, which is in the memo that Lisa posted. And, the whole point of the CLCPA is that it provides a fair and accurate accounting of our greenhouse gas emissions, regardless of where they occur. Next slide. And this is the final slide. This is not just about making our emissions disappear. In real life, if they allowed these changes to go through, it could increase our emissions by promoting these false climate solutions. And we've seen this happen in other countries, in Europe, elsewhere, when they do that. It's a terrible outcome. Just because the other states and countries have failed to address these doesn't mean New York should follow suit. And we need real solutions, not magic tricks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Lorenzo, I think you're going to have to refresh the deck and go to slide, I think it's 27, where Eric's slides start. Thanks so much to you, Laura, for demonstrating the sort of Enron accounting that the governor has in mind here, which would allow many different kinds of things to continue unabated, should all of that get erased from the law. And that is what the governor, although we've never seen any language and most of the legislators haven't seen her exact language, we can assume based on her 2023 assault on the law that this is what she has in mind. And so it's much more than most people really credit and understand. So I want to go to our last but not least speaker, Eric Walker, a dear friend and colleague. Eric Walker is the Earthjustice Senior Policy Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice, based in Buffalo, New York, brings decades of experience to solving social problems through the lens of climate change, energy systems,
Okay.
and equality. And he doesn't want me to do the rest because he wants to get to his slides. So jump in, Eric. I was giving Lorenzo a second to get the slides up, but here we go.
It's okay.
Eric, start talking.
The short version is I am the energy nerd at We Act, and I'm happy to be with you all this morning. I'm going to try and keep it brief. I know we have some questions we want to get to. So I, excuse me, I just wanted to start out and by drilling in a little bit on some of what I wanted to cover. Liz spoke about, but as she noted, there's a lot of overlap here. We're swimming in a very interconnected sea and morass, quite frankly, of misinformation and interconnected policy levers that are meant to confuse people through the misinformation and then have them ultimately give into this or capitulate to this idea of changing the law. We'll click through this real quick. Just to quickly, can we go to the next slide, please? Oh no, back one. And just to give a high level overview, I think most folks know, and thanks thanks Holly for jumping into the membership. We love you, heart. Just a quick overview. What is Cap and Invest? I think most of us know that it's meant to be an emissions reductions program. What it is essentially is, polluters pay for amounts. Their obligated entities will pay for emissions, and that those emissions will be bought and put into a bank account. That big bank account is going to fund a bunch of great things that are going to help us transition the economy. As Liz noted, it's the sort of plan A. It was a very strong recommendation of the scoping plan back in 2022. In fact, it is not just plan A, it is the only plan. There is no plan B. As far as we can tell from that the state has to meet the emissions reductions goals laid out in the CLCPA. So we're really excited to have it. And that means that polluters will ultimately create that big pot of money, and then the revenue will go back to not just those programs for large scale renewables and grid modernization, but also back into the hands of New Yorkers to help pay for the upfront costs of making the transitions to clean heating and cooling, clean transportation, et cetera, for our building sector and our transportation sector. Next slide, please. And I'll just drop in the chat the link to the pre-proposal. If I think there was a big question about that a little earlier.
I got you on the links. You talk. I'll try.
Okay, great. Thank you. What is the value proposition of Cap and Invest, not just on the emission side? It is a humongous potential pot of money, right? The scenario, the minimal scenario that was modeled by NYSERDA put about $3 billion into that climate action fund set of accounts that would help pay for the transition. And that 10 billion over 10 years of the modeled life of the program, that's $30 billion at minimum, right? And so we see a huge need for resources. We have programs that are oversubscribed and underfunded, Empower Plus, for example, the AMATE program, for example, for multifamily buildings. The list goes on and on. we need those resources available to help support and accelerate the transition that is being hobbled by a lack of resources and a lack of policy and political will. Affordability, of course, is the key word of the day. Uh, 30% of the a minimum of 30% of the auction revenue was meant to go to cost mitigation strategies to support households making a transition. That there's a little bit of wiggle room between the 30 and the upper ceiling of that, of what's possible given the current language that's in the Cap and Invest program. There's some effort to tweak that to allow for even more because of the pain that folks are experiencing now. And we really are supportive and excited about that. And really, for EJ communities like the folks that WEACT works with, a firm and declining cap. Those are the things that make a strong program. And excuse me, those were foundations of what was proposed in the pre-proposal. Let's see, simple explainer. I will send I'll put a link to the pre-proposal in there, Lisa. I think it's in one of the slides. I have my second slide. But if folks want to get into the weeds, they can get into the weeds on the pre-proposal. I would love to hear folks talk about that.
In the chat.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. What does it get us? There's a multiplier effect. The 30 billion, the $30 billion gets us, $47 billion of economic activity, 300,000 new jobs in multiple sectors, mostly in construction, for all the things we have to build. $1,000 in net savings for households under 200K. So that means 85% of households in New York come out ahead in the program that was modeled by NYSERDA, not having to pay the $4,000 that was mentioned in that catastrophic memo that was released in February. And again, it's $30 billion in climate investments is nothing to shake a stick at. Next slide. But as Liz said, this program got withdrawn inexplicably and out of nowhere in early January of last year, which is why we sued her. So what happened? Plan goes away. We spent months, literally months, talking to the governor's office about releasing the program, giving them enough political cover because they were scared about getting blowback. They anticipated this whole conversation around affordability in the gubernatorial election being a bit of a third rail. We said, no, we got you, ready to go. All of a sudden, it's not. So we're like, enough's enough. Let's get it in. Essentially, the crux of the lawsuit, those are the named plaintiffs in the suit, was to follow the law, release the greenhouse gas emissions regulations, and implement the law. And that's really what's asked. It gives a lot of the law gives a lot of flexibility. The CLCP gives a lot of flexibility about how to meet those regulations. And in fact, in conversations with litigants, in fact, the program that was set to be released on January 2025 didn't even meet the 2030 target. And everyone in the, most folks in the environmental and active advocacy community were willing to stomach that just to get forward progress on the law. And quite frankly, that's really all we're asking for is forward progress and implementation. Next slide. This is basically a snapshot of the timeline, right? So we don't need to go through sort of the 2025, except for noting that in October, we got a positive ruling in our first case. A month later, they appealed, and we've been in adjudicating this court case in the court of public opinion, as Lisa noted, for the last few months ever since. Finally, the DEC put in a motion to delay oral arguments, which were set to be on April 28th. They were kicked back until May 28th with the idea that the DEC said that the governor is in active conversations with the legislature, although we disputed that there may not even be a positive outcome in their to their kind of position. They were granted the delay. We have another month before oral arguments are going to be set to be had. The reason why I think that's important is because they've essentially argued the same positions that they lost on, which were that we're making progress. We've got hydrofluorocarbon progress. We've instituted policies to help bring the state into compliance with the law. But we know that cap and invest is hard, which is our solution to meeting the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and we think it's way too expensive, so we don't want to do it. And the judge said, "No, you don't." As a quote in the bottom says, the DEC was not given the discretion to indefinitely delay, so you got to go do it. This is just essentially a stall tactic, which I think I'm going to move us to the next slide. And the strategy in a nutshell is just stall accountability, manufacture a crisis, and then use the budget process to force the legislature to capitulate because the governor has outsized power there. I was going to jump into, I know we only have 5 minutes left. I want to get some time for questions here. I will drop a link to the chat. I know someone asked about the Public Service Commission hearing in the chat. Just quickly, just flash the next slide. Right, exactly. That is just a back door to changing the CLCPA through a Public Service Commission hearing. I'm going to ask Lisa to drop a link to that in the chat. There's a webinar we're going to have next week about going into the deep weeds of that. We don't have time for that today, but I think it's that we have to close this back door because I think the danger here is if we're successful in mitigating any changes to the CLCPA in the budget process, the PSC hearing is the back door to potentially suspend the clean energy programs that are in the clean energy standard, which would be dangerous. So I'm going to leave it there for now and then maybe jump into questions.
Thanks, Eric. We can't do questions quite yet. Lorenzo, could you take us to slide 26? And thanks everybody for your patience. I'm sorry we have so little time left, but we do have some very important actions for you to take today. And yes, thanks. A round of applause for Eric. That was very comprehensive in too short a time. And Lorenzo, can we go back to the slides real quick? I wanted to share with you all, and can you go to, that's it. Some of New York's advocates, including Eric and I, were just in Chicago. No, the one before that, please. We're just in Chicago for a retreat, and I want us to remember that we are not alone in this work here in New York. That there's a whole huge, or not huge, but small but mighty network of advocates and lawyers and wonks and grassroots activists who are working hard alongside of us here in this space. And I wanted to leave us with this quote from Chicago architect Daniel Burnham that was shared at this wonderful conference. "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work, remembering that noble, logical diagram once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone will be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Remember that our sons and grandsons are going to do things that would stagger us. Let your watchword be order and your beacon beauty. Think big." And I just really wanted to leave you with that. And let's go to the next slide. We have a bunch of actions to take. And we're telling basically our governor, our legislators to think big because they are thinking small. And this is really a huge problem. Think about the precedent that this governor is sending out across the entire country in an election year where a blue state with a blue legislature decides that the thing that they want to do, that they're going to hang their hat on, is rolling back climate progress in the midst of an international energy crisis. It's literally bonkers. So the first link I'm going to share a bunch of links, but we have 2 emails to send, one to the governor and to your legislators. It won't show your legislators if you're if you're represented by the minority, only if you're represented by the majority. We have an activity. Please drop into your legislator's district office tomorrow and say hi, say please defend the climate law. They are home tomorrow, supposedly, and just drop by and say hello. We have a toolkit for that. We are also advocating for expanding solar. This is one of the bright spots in our climate progress that has very few bright spots, and the governor's office wants to shut this distributed solar effort down, or they have suspended it. We want to get that back going. There is a lobby day in Albany for Earth Day on Wednesday. And there is the other webinar that Eric mentioned. So I'm going to put all those links in the chat. And now why don't you unshare, and we'll see if there's time for any questions while I get all those links. And sorry, that was a lot of links in a short time. Betta, can you help moderate the questions while I grab those links? Thanks.
Sure. Let's see. Questions. There's been a lot of things put in the chat here. Okay. Eric, are you seeing Kevin's question? What is the mechanism by which a cap and invest system saves people money? I'm just wondering where the 30 billion comes from.
Yeah, sure. So there's the auction, which is where polluters get they quantify their emissions from their business processes. There's an overall that turns into an overall state number that has to get declined over time. You get a certain amount of allowances as an obligated entity. You buy those allowances, and then that's where the money comes from. It's basically a dollar assigned for an allowance. In some case, the lowest one that was modeled was, I think, $14 for a metric ton of carbon equivalent. And so the number of allowances times the price equals total revenue. That's how we get the money. The rules around cap and invest were adopted in the fiscal year 2024 budget. Essentially lays out a climate action fund that's broken into 3 different accounts: a consumer climate action account, a investment account, and right now I'm forgetting the 3rd account. Forgive me for my effervescent memory and not having slept well in an airport yesterday. So that investment account, the 2 biggest ones are the investment account. There's a small business account and energy intensive exposed industries account. Sorry, thank you. That the consumer climate action account is the 30% minimum that has to go from that total revenue pot to help support households like you and me, support the transition. So that could come in a number of different ways. The most frequently talked about cost mitigation strategy is a direct kind of payment to us through our bills or in direct cash transfers to us. So that's how you get the total bundle of money and how you would support people making the transition. But there's also, through the investment accounts, incentives that would be embedded in the programs for things like electric vehicles, things for retrofits to buildings, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, Eric. So Melissa has a question about NYSERDA, and are there any agencies that I guess aren't the governor's serf, as Melissa says? Do any of them have decent morals to help us? I mean, I think as we're seeing with the federal government, right? If the top dog in the government makes a decision, then agencies are, for the most part, required to carry it out and support that decision making. It doesn't mean there aren't a lot of great people who work at NYSERDA, who care about climate, who care about clean energy, and are doing a lot of fantastic work. So I wouldn't want to lump everyone into that category, but it just sort of is what it is with government. And I think like our best chance right now is our legislative champions and making sure that they're fighting this and showing the governor that there is a really strong climate movement and enough people in the legislature who are going to stand up to protect the CLCPA. But that's just my 2 cents. I don't know if Eric, you want to chime in, or Laura, or any of our other folks on here. We also
I have a longer answer, but we don't have time for it.
We can, if for those who joined us who only have this 1 hour, don't feel rude. I know we have a busy day, but for those who can stay on a little longer, I think Laura and Eric may be able to stay a little longer for some more Q&A, and we'll let it go a little over time. We do try to end promptly after an hour, but we can extend today we had so much information and there's so much going on. I can share with you that we believe that the decisions being made about the CLCPA rollbacks will be happening next week, most
Yeah.
likely. That is what we are hearing. So the time to act is right now. We don't have a lot of time left. I would say that our target is our legislators who are, on the back foot here with the governor. She's not really our target in this campaign. She's our opposition. She's not really movable. I mean, I'm sure reach out to her, call her, but my suggestion is, encourage your legislators to fight for this. Tell them you're paying attention. This is a top issue for you. And you don't want to back down on New York's climate law. You can talk about the greenhouse gas accounting. You can talk about all of the cap and invest program, any piece of this that you want to pull out and sort of talk about why it's important to you. I encourage you to do so. Okay, next question.
Benji has a question about sort of the political context that Hochul has repeatedly said the context is different from 2019, given COVID, supply chain issues, etc. Do you have any additional context? So this is all sort of subjective, speculative, since no one is in the governor's mind, but I don't know if Eric,
Well,
you want to weigh
I,
in, really,
I'll go to Eric,
or
but I
anybody?
just want to share this memo from someone who used to work at NYSERDA and now doesn't have to speak for NYSERDA that really walks through why the
Jamie
climate
Dickerson, yeah.
law is still very much viable, very much doable, and so important. Eric, did you want to take it as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Jamie Dickerson piece is really worth a read. I think my take on it there. So in some respects, Kathy Hochul is kind of painting a picture of a reality that shifted under our feet. There is no denying that. I think what's also important to say is that the reality has shifted from the very dated version of a new reality that she's putting forward. She keeps talking about like 2020, 2022 as though that's now. It's not now. We are in a much, much different time now. We are in a place where we are losing control of absolutely every piece of the global energy infrastructure in real time, from the war in Ukraine to this war in Iran to invasions of South American countries to control their oil supplies. It is a it is an emerging global catastrophe that's not being acknowledged in the context of Governor Hochul's position. That is, to me, mind-boggling. It's an anchoring in a narrative that doesn't meet the reality that people are experiencing, but is trying to convince them of a reality that used to exist 2 years ago. And so I think it's just bad politics to try and convince people that what they're experiencing isn't real. Don't believe what you're feeling. Believe me, because I'm the person who knows exactly what's happening here. And the reason why we need to do to alleviate that pain, what we need to do to alleviate the pain you're experiencing, I'm telling you, is not caused by the things you think it is gut this law. I mean, it's a very convoluted logic fallacy that she wants everybody to opt in on and then wants to force the legislature to comply with.
Laura,
Yes, exactly. Deny your reality, accept mine. Yep.
I'm going to go to Laura.
Well, I think she also spends a lot of time meeting with the biofuels folks and other people and believes them. All the stuff that she presented in 2023, that was for the crisis that we find ourselves in before DEC had not met its timeline. She believes her position, which makes it harder and very difficult for the legislature, as you can imagine, but they've stood up for it, and hopefully we can keep on pressuring them to stand up for it.
I think that's a great place to end. So we have possibly as little as, 3, 4 more business days to advocate strongly on behalf of our climate law. We will send all of the links, the slides, and the recording to everyone who registered for this teach-in. Thank you so much to our wonderful presenters. Can we have a round of applause for them again? And I'm sorry that we went a little bit over time today, but I'm going to leave you with one last thought. There were over 100 people that signed up for this teach-in, and if all of them take actions, that's 100 actions. But if each of you reaches out to someone who's not following climate, someone in your life who lives in New York who's not following this issue, who might be confused, who might have been scared, they might have seen a headline that said the climate law will cost every family $4,000 a year. That would scare me if I didn't know. Please reach out to them today and say, hey, I just went to this webinar. We're in a really tough situation here politically. Can you help out by taking this one action or two actions? Come to Albany with me, send this email. Can I show you this recording to review? Anything you want to do, but let's try to get as many phone calls, emails, office drop-ins, and in-person actions. And I just want to give a shout out to the wonderful advocates who during this webinar are in New York City, in Union Square, a whole bunch of faith leaders and climate advocates had a press conference while we were all here on our Zoom. So people are working, people are activated, people are motivated, and it's never been more important. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.